If you take out your message outline for today, we've been working through the life of David. We have this week and next week we'll finish up. When I think of the life of David, one of the things I think about is in many ways it's a metaphor for our lives. There's a lot that we can learn about how God dealt with David and the kinds of things that he dealt with, both highs and lows that are instructive for us, not just about living, but how does God deal with us, especially during times of mystery and times where we're just perplexed about what's going on. Is God around? When I think about the life of David, and you remember when we first started, David, after the great beginning with Goliath and the victory, he became a fugitive for between 15 and 20 years. And he was running for his life. And during those times, it's easy to forget that. We just think about Goliath, and we think about him king, and we think about Bathsheba, and we think about the golden age of Israel. But it's easy to overlook those years of being a fugitive and on the run for his very life. When I think about this, when times are turbulent, it's sort of like we're an ocean liner, and we're having rough seas side of a if you've ever been on a cruise, you know that a cruise ship pulls into the dock and it drops anchor. And it probably doesn't need to drop anchor in a lot of these cruise stops because of the way the harbor's built. But it's very easy when the ship is harbored there to feel that the ship is anchored. And now, whether it is or not is sort of, who knows. But because there's no waves and there's no wind, there's really not a need for an anchor. And in our lives, without Christ, it's sort of easy to have that metaphor, that I can feel anchored as long as the winds are not too rough and the seas are not too rough. And that's how we live naturally without Christ. Instead, this world does have plenty of rough winds and rough seas, and that is when you can feel the weight of the anchor in one hand, even though it doesn't mitigate against the hard winds and rough seas. You can be anchored and at the same time be anchored at the same time when life seems like it's all falling apart and the winds are going all around you. One of the things that I think of when I think about this chapter we're looking at today is it's sort of like an appendix to the book of 2 Samuel, kind of like the book of Judges. So even though this is near the very end of his life, what we're going to read today, it doesn't occur at the end of his life. It occurs when he is roughly about age 33. So for some of you that are in your early 30s, this is that time. This is the time frame that he's writing. And this is his testimony about God, especially during the times of being a fugitive and running for his life for between 15 and 20 years. What he has learned, as you will see in this particular chapter, is the character of God is most learned in hardship. The character of God is most learned in hardship. There are times when we go through hardship and we think, God, why aren't you doing something about it? And I wonder how many times God would say to us, I am doing something about it. I'm trying to reveal something of who I am to you in order to anchor you. That's so unintuitive to us. But it truly what the theme of this particular chapter in 2 Samuel 22. You will hear David highlight the character of God. It starts off in verse 1 of chapter 22. David sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies, meaning Goliath and the Philistines when he went to battle, and the hand of Saul. So he was about 33 years old, maybe a few years older from that, but it was after a season of 15 or 20 years of just unceasing hardship. Now let that sink in for a minute. We don't think that's how it's supposed to be with us. Is it possible that God might let me go through 15 or 20 years of hardship? It may not be running for your life. It may be in a marriage. It may be with one of your kids. It may be with finances. It may be at work. It may be difficulties with friends at church. We just don't think that way, 15 or 20 years of hardship. Now, one of the things I love about David is he's the warrior and he's the king. But if you read the book of Psalms, there are a whole bunch of Psalms written by David. He's also a poet and a musician. And this chapter is loaded with poetry. He's using imagery to describe a whole bunch of different things that he wants us to recognize. He starts off with the imagery of God's character. The Lord is my rock, and he has 8 different things he mentions here. The Lord is my rock, the first one. And the idea here of rock is a firm foundation. You think about the parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talked about the man who built his house on the sand and the man who built his house on the rock. For a long time, as long as there weren't any winds or waves, there's no difference in the 2 houses. But once the waves hit, the surf hits, the house built on the sand is going to be in big trouble, while the house built on the rock is unshakable. That's the first image he talks about. He says, this is how God has been to me. He has been a foundation for me, rock. And then fortress is the second image. I'm a sucker for old Western movies. And one of the things I always loved about the Old West, both in history and movies, is the cavalry and the fort. The stockade fort. And the thing about a fort is that you may be outnumbered 1,000 Indians to 200 cavalrymen. But because you're in the fort, it adds significantly to your defense. And that's what the second image he uses here. God was my defense during those years. Number 3, my deliverer, meaning I could not deliver myself. Somebody else had to do the heavy lifting. My God is my rock in whom I take. Number 4, refuge. And the idea here of refuge is in the midst of all that was falling apart or seemingly falling apart in his life, there was something about knowing God that allowed his heart to be at rest, to have a sense of safety. Number 5 is my shield. Shield, of course, is an instrument of defense. Number 6, the horn of my salvation. It's an Old Testament imagery for strength or power. From violent men, he is my stronghold. Here the idea, we might use the word citadel, but you can think of a fort, maybe like an merry old England or Ireland or Scotland with the rocks around the fort. But then inside of the walls of the fort, there's a tower. And the tower would be called the citadel. And that's sort of the second line of defense. So if the enemy was able to break through the rocks of the outer fortress, they still had to somehow figure out how to scale the citadel inside. And that's the image he uses here of stronghold. My refuge, and number 8, my Savior. When I think about Savior, just in sort of general terms, I think about the fellow on the cruise ship who's had too much to drink at night, and he's out walking on the deck, and he falls over the side of the ship, and nobody sees him. That is a hopeless situation. There is absolutely no hope unless somebody sees it and takes immediate action to get a lifeboat and get out there as quick as possible. Then the man can be saved. That's the last image that he uses here. The second piece of imagery that David uses here has to do with danger, the kinds of danger he went through. Now, most of this historically was on the run. Saul with an army of 3,000 men. The most we know David ever had was 600, significantly outgunned and outmanned, and he was on the run. But I love the imagery that he uses to describe not what happened, but the effect of the danger on him. You follow me here? The effect that it had on David. Let's look, we start with verse 5. The waves of death swirled about me. This is imagery. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. Now, it's one thing for us to watch. You mean David felt like this? This is how it seemed to him? And the answer is yes. Of course, the next question is, have you ever felt that way? And when you do feel that way, is that a surprise to you? Or is it part of living here in our fallen world? I take a lot of comfort in the fact that God allowed him to go through some very, very difficult times without rescuing him in the sense of extricating him from the danger. It helps me a lot with my expectations, let's say. And then there's imagery about deliverance. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I called out to my God. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came to his ears. A lot of times when we're going through difficult times, we pray and nothing changes. And the first question we ask is, did God hear my prayers, or does God care? Well, in this situation, he was in desperate situations for 15 or 20 years. And at the same time, it wasn't a problem of God didn't hear. And it wasn't a problem of God didn't care. It's just that God was doing something very different in David than what you or I wish he would have done if we had been David. The earth trembled and quaked. The foundations of the heavens shook. They trembled because God was angry. So here's the imagery of deliverance. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of it. The imagery here is similar to the 10 plagues in Egypt. He's kind of referring back to that. He's kind of reminding his people, remember when? Remember when we had our backs against the wall? We were in slavery and had no chance of getting out of Egypt? This poet is using the same analogy. He parted the heavens and came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. Now, I love that image. And he uses this image several times in this passage about darkness. Darkness has several different aspects to it. One aspect has to do with mystery. When life is perplexing and we can't figure out what's going on, and we can make no rhyme or reason of what's going on, we can make why in the world does Saul continue to follow me, and why is he so resentful and bitter towards me? There's no question, there's no answer to that question. The question just lingers. This is the kind of darkness. We just don't have the answers we wish we had. And the question of why just sort of dangles out there. Not directly said. We have to look for the whys elsewhere than how we want it. Dark clouds are under his feet. Verse 13, out of the brightness of his presence, bolts of lightning blaze forth. The Lord thundered from heaven. And here, David is using the imagery of Mount Sinai and the giving of the 10 Commandments. A sort of awesome day. That was just the description of where God came down to give the commandments to the people. He shot arrows and scattered the enemies, bolts of lightning, and routed them. The valleys of the sea were exposed. The foundations of the earth laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord. Again, imagery of deliverance, of God working at the blast of breath from his nostrils. He reached down from on high and he took hold of me. And the language shifts here from just sort of this general grand pictures of what God did in delivering him now to something very personal. You'll hear the word me a lot. He and me. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters, like out in the Caribbean. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from foes who were too strong for me. Sometimes in this world, the world that we live in, it seems overwhelming. And the enemy and the things that we have to face, I just don't have the resources to do left to myself. That's how David felt. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. You can see what he learned here. He learned from the 8 images we looked at the beginning, and here he learned that what God was teaching him through these difficult years was the character of God personally. Not in a theology class, not in a book learning, okay, got it, check, 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 check. But in his everyday life in the midst of trials. He brought me into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. This is such an amazing thing. Gone from the grand majesty of God down to the very personal delight of a father delighting in his son. And then the passage next has to do with duty. He thinks about his duty. God brought me into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he has rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord I have not done evil by turning away from my God. All his laws are before me. I have not turned away from his decrees. Now, remember, David did not write these words about his track record at the end of his life. That's how it looks in 2 Samuel, towards the second or third last chapter. But he wrote it when he was young, about age 33. And when he talks about how he had kept his hands from doing evil and the Lord rewarded him, what he's referring to is how he related to King Saul. And you remember from our weeks there that there were times when after the great victory over Goliath that Saul brought David into the palace. And David, he became very resentful of David. David would play his instrument and it would help Saul, but the resentment that was birthed in Saul and took years and years of growing and bitterness began with him taking a spear and hurling it at David. And you remember back in those early chapters here, David did not retaliate. He didn't pick up the spear and throw it back at him. He didn't run across the room and get into a fight with him. And another incident happened, the same thing. King Saul picks up a spear in anger, hurls it across the room at David. And David was agile, and he got away from that. There were times where David did not respond at any of those years. Even though he'd been anointed king by Samuel earlier in life, there was not one time where he told somebody, hey, I'm the one that's supposed to be king. Go talk to Samuel about that. Never did that. He would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed as he saw that. Now, it's not my position to do that. That's up to God. Whenever he wants me to be king, that's up to God. It's not up to me. There were two incidences where David could have slain King Saul. Once in a cave, once when Saul was sleeping in the camp with his army. At both those times, he was loath to do that. That's what he's referring to here. In the midst of trials and suffering and hardship and discouragement, one of the things that kept him going was, I have got to do what's right. I've got to do what's right. And that's what helped him all through these many years. And then verse 24, I have been blameless before him. I've kept myself from sin. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness in his sight. To the faithful you show yourself faithful. To the blameless you show yourself blameless. To the pure you show yourself pure. But to the crooked you show yourself shrewd. You save the humble, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them low. Now, when I think about this particular time, what he writes here, he did pass those tests when he was, in his 20s and early 30s. He did pass those tests. But after he became king first of Judah and 7 years later of both Israel and Judah, you know that he married 5 more women. And he had an affair with Bathsheba and married her and had her husband Uriah killed in battle. His life just, you think of that. What happened to David? And we've been looking at that the last several weeks. So when I think about his testimony here at age 33, what strikes me is, let this be a warning to all of us. That though we may have had several years or a number of years of spiritual success that was tested again and again and again, that does not necessarily mean that now I have everything it needs in order to pass any more tests. There are some times where David failed miserably and quite publicly, as we've looked at. This is a warning to everyone. If you're in your 20s and early 30s and you think, I've got some things going on spiritually, well, I'm happy for you. I've been there before. We started the church when I was 33 years old. But there's just a lot more time left to go in the game. So keep your pride to yourself here. Be warned. Now, this is the first, we just get to the halfway point of this chapter. And so far, what God has helped him do is be on the defensive and to do it well. He's sort of, maybe he was the first guy with the Hippocratic Oath. Job number 1, do no harm. Do you learn that in training? Do you have some of that? A little bit? A little bit. Do no harm. So for the first part of his 15 or 20 years, Yes. But his life is not just on the defensive. There were things he had to do. There was offensive, things that had to be accomplished, particularly in battle. And so the next imagery here is the call to action. When we started the church, again, I was 33 years old, and we had 3 single gals that were helping us. And we were just kind of a ragtag bunch of 5 of us trying to get this thing going. But one of the things I remember the first few months was a realization about me and my faith. I realized that part of me, I began to see part of my faith is really strong. And I began to think of this as sort of my passive faith. I'll pray about anything. If I need to fast. I'll wait on God. I'm not going to jump in and take matters into my own hands. I know that's a bad idea. That part I could see really clearly. But the other part, the kind of faith that I began to think of as an active faith, faith to take the initiative, to meet the person across the room, to go down to the Woodbridge tennis courts and try to get a doubles game with strangers I've never met, to go to a local basketball court in Woodbridge where there are 20 guys and just start to fit in every Saturday morning and meet guys and get to know them, to pick up the phone, to meet people in our neighborhood, to meet people down at the swimming pool that also had little kids like us. That kind of faith, the active faith, I began to think, I'm not so strong in. It was kind of a big stretch here. Now, both of these things are illustrated in David's testimony here. The first part of what I would have think of as a passive faith, the defensive part of his life was Saul. He did well. He also did well on the active faith in terms of action. Verse 29, you are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord turns my darkness into light. With your help, I can advance against a troop. With my God, I can scale a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is flawless. He is a shield for all who take refuge in him. Who is God besides the Lord, and who is the rock except our God? There's just a whole bunch of imagery here of there's a challenge, a battle in front of him, and no matter what the odds are, the one thing he can't do is just retreat or go home. He has to take action. He has to lead the troops forward, and he does this. And when I think about this, I think, a lot of times when there are issues in my life that I have to deal with, I just wish that God would just sort of swoop in and just deal with it and then just kind of move on. But my life seems a lot like David in that sense, is that God doesn't swoop in nearly as much as I wish he would. God kind of swoops down and hovers and seems to say to me, what are you going to do? You need to pick up the phone. You need to make a call. You need to go have lunch with that fella. You need to get a hold of that guy. There's a problem that needs to be dealt with. Talk to some people about it. I'd rather just you swoop in and deal with it. On the backside of your handout, the next imagery is praise, and he finishes with, just as he thinks about this whole thing, it's like, to sum up, all I can do is looking back on these 15 or 20 years is just praise God. I'm just amazed at what he did. But let me just finish with 2 images that struck me the most, and they come, the imagery of trust on the back of your handout. Verse 29 is the first verse. He says, you are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord turns my darkness into light. One of the things I like about David's testimony here is he uses the word darkness like we've seen before. He uses it again here. And when I think of darkness, I think of 2 things with David. One is his fugitive years. And during all those times when he's running for his life and he's scaling cliffs and hiding in ditches or in caves or climbing rocks, he sees the army coming and he's got to run. He's got to feed 400 or 600 of his own men. He's got to find water. He's got to forage for food for years. Times of darkness. But the second way that darkness is an imagery is of mystery. When you're perplexed, when you just can't for the life of you figure out why does this keep going on and on and on and on, and no matter what I do, I can't get it fixed, and I don't understand why this struggle continues. That's what he's describing here. That's what life felt like to David during these years. But notice he says, at the first part of this, you are my lamp. And the Lord turns my darkness into light. Now, back then there were no street lights for David or parking lots, flooded with lights, or shopping centers like the district with lights everywhere. You're out in the country for the most part. For David, out in the wilderness, there are no lights. When the sun goes down, the people during that time, they had oil lamps, and oil was precious to these people. They bought oil like we buy food. It's just a necessity. And when the sun goes down, you have oil lamps at home, and they provide light. But in the Oriental culture, they don't just provide light, they provide comfort. Comfort. A symbol of comfort. That's the imagery David uses here. But what's striking to me is that David's on the run. He's not carrying around an oil lamp and a sack of oil. He has no oil lamp, and he has no oil. But what does he say? Well, the first word's the most important one. You. You are my lamp. My source of comfort. What did he learn during those 15 or 20 years? He learned this. An anchor for his life in the midst of all kinds of turmoil. And then verse 34. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to stand on the heights. And the imagery there, which would have been certainly true for us, he's on the run from King Saul. And there are times where he's out in the desert, and there are times when he's in what they called the wilderness. And there are other times where the safest place to be was in the most treacherous place to be. The Rockies, the mountains, the crags, the boulders. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to stand on the heights. When I was a kid, we lived in Colorado, and there were times where we'd go up on a drive on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, and there were times where you would see bighorn sheep. And you're up above the timberline, up above 14,000 feet. It's just breathtaking. And you would see some of these bighorn sheep scaling these pretty steep cliffs. If you haven't seen that, you can go on YouTube and you'll find this, within seconds. But what he says here, he said, this was me. This is what it was like for me. On the run, hiding out in the clefts of the rock, scaling boulders, sometimes climbing up sheer walls, hiding out at the very precipice of a cliff. And yet, as hard as all that was, notice the image he says. He made my feet like the feet of a deer. Somehow, he enabled me to go through the hardest season of my life, and he gave me the ability to do it. That's his testimony. In the same way that a deer can stand at the top. The most secure place for David during these years was in the most dangerous place, in the mountains. Let's pray together. Father, as we look back at David's life, particularly the first part of his life, there are things that we should glean from this and learn and add to how we see life, how we see our life. There's so much about this that when we go through things like this, we think that something's wrong. Either we're doing something wrong or you're doing something wrong, and that may not be the case at all. David was doing what was right. And you left him in 15 or 20 years of hardship, of danger. But during those years, you taught him that you are his rock, his fortress, his refuge, his stronghold, his citadel, his anchor. And there is nothing more important that you're trying to teach us than those very things.